Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. But how do they do it? Next on the prophetic connection. Turn here. Waiting for the day when the Messiah will come. Consider the words of this intriguing verse that's found in the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." The word seasons in the original Hebrew can be interpreted festivals. And in that context could be linked with the festivals of Israel, the feasts of Israel, if you like, the rhythm of the Jewish year according to their calendar, but not simply their calendar, the festivals that God gave them and told them to observe, as written in the law of Moses. God said there'd be signs in the heavens. There's signs, seasons, or if you like, festivals. So the sun is not there simply to illuminate the day. The Bible is telling us that God is going to use the sun, the moon, and the stars in other ways as well. Then yet another intriguing verse words found in the lips of Jesus in Matthew 24, when he gave that long discourse about the signs that would precede his coming. And of course, he talked about famines, pestilences, earthquakes in many different places, false prophets, all of those signs, but he said something else. He talked about a time of tribulation. And then verse 29 of Matthew 24, he said, immediately after the tribulation or trouble of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes, if you like, the nations of the earth, will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And then these hopeful words that come immediately after that statement. And he, God, will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So when Christ comes, we know that he comes because of Armageddon. And Armageddon, he appears. But it says, and that will be a time of judgment for the nations of the earth. And of course, the mother of all battles. But he says, at that time as well, he will send his angels, and they will gather those that are his. What does he say? From the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So there'll be those who are on the Lord's side, and those are the ones that he will send for, and those who are not. And they will meet him anyway at a place called Armageddon.
Why did Jesus talk about signs in the heavens that would point to his return?
I believe that God talks through Jesus about the signs in the heavens. Number one, because he's coming from heaven. That our eyes ought to be heavenward. We ought to be looking to the skies and constantly be reminded he is there and he is coming. And I could talk about the individual signs, whether it's the sun or the moon. But really it's all about the heavens and the God of heaven and his return to the earth.
Many people today are talking about the blood moon phenomenon and the fact that the four of these lunar eclipses in a row coincide with the dates of Jewish feasts or festivals, specifically in 2014 and 2015, rare occurrences that will not happen again in the 21st century. When viewed from the vantage point of history, blood moons can be seen as harbingers of significant events that affected the Jewish people, such as the rebirth of Israel in 1948, or the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967.
You know, a lot of people are talking about the blood moons, and I've studied it and I read some of the material on it that people are putting out there. And there must be something to the blood moons happening during the feast times of the biblical feast of Israel and accelerating in the next 2 years. There must be something to that, because Jesus himself said, we will see signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. And some people said, oh, what's the moon have to do? Well, Jesus said it. So I think these are harbingers and warnings, but it's something to be really prepared for.
Because we must rein in the disrespect for the environment, which is, by the way, in Judaism, something that's very important. We do care about the environment. But then other scientists say, well, even all the global emissions is not enough to create a change in our weather systems so drastically as we see it today. So then what is the question here? Is it global warming? Is it climate change? Or is it signs of the heavens that we are beginning to see the greatest typhoons take place, the greatest tsunamis in history take place, the greatest of hurricanes, the most violent of tornadoes, the greatest of earthquakes? It seems that all through the generations, there's always been earthquakes, there's always been floods, there's always been all these various signs in the heavens. But what we are seeing are the most violent changes, mood swings in creation and in the atmospheric pressures around us, that suddenly there is something to stand up and take notice of that is quite different than at any other time previously in history. But add to that one other thing. Every time there are world leaders getting ready to push Israel to the brink of destruction through the signing of some kind of a peace agreement, the weather patterns go wacko.
Do these unusual signs in the heavens and on the earth mean that the day of the Lord, that is the coming of the Messiah and judgment of the nations by him, are closer than ever before?
The image is very, very heavy. It's almost sort of when I read it, I think of almost like weapons of mass destruction. And again, you have to keep in mind, whenever I'm teaching this stuff, I say, remember, it's a negative prophecy and it's a warning. It doesn't have to happen. And specifically, Joel is talking about this will be the plague that God strikes the nations that come against Israel. So it's not even directed at the Jewish people, which is not to say that it's not going to be scary for the Jewish people living in the land of Israel. But the idea is that as we approach the real final showdown, God is sort of like that ultimate Hollywood image of the cavalry coming over the hill at the last minute to save the Jewish people. And that's really what's being talked about there. That it's very scary, and who can stand, who can stand the fright and the danger that's going to be there. But nonetheless, even though it's going to be scary, the words of the prophets are always, as scary as they sound, meant to be really reassuring. They're meant to be a wake-up call, but to let us know that God never abandons his people. And even at the last minutes, there's a very famous quote of the rabbis, never give up hope for salvation, even when the sword is at your neck. Don't give up hope, because hope is always on the way, and salvation always comes. And that's really, despite the scary language that Joel is using, the real message is that we can get through it. We will see the light at the end of this tunnel, but it can be a very scary ride until we finally get to the climax and the happy ending of the story.
But why did the prophets use such vivid and frightening imagery to describe the signs in the heavens that would accompany the day of the Lord?
Blood, fire, which is very scary imagery. And then this is where the Hebrew is so interesting, because it's Timrot Ashan is the word in Hebrew. Timrot is the root of the word tamar, taf mem resh, which is a date. Date palms of smoke. What's a date palm of smoke? So in the Middle East, we don't have so many mushrooms because it's kind of dry. But if anyone's seen the image of a date palm, it's very much the same sort of silhouette of a mushroom cloud. So what's being described there, again, prophets like Joel and Ezekiel and Zechariah are living way before the nuclear age and weapons of mass destruction. But the image of a column of smoke in the image, in the size and the shape of a date palm, is clearly meant, in my opinion, it's pretty unambiguous, to indicate the possible use of, God forbid, some weapons of mass destruction.
Are blood moons really warnings in the heavens of impending nuclear holocausts on Earth?
So again, that's the image of the blood moon, which is a very scary image in many cultures. But also we have to appreciate that when does the moon have that color? When the sky is filled with smoke. or after God forbid, some sort of nuclear attack. When you ever read what happens, that you get ashes falling from heaven and all kinds of weird meteorological things happening that change the color of light, and it could well be referring to something similar to that. He's seeing some sort of image. I always tell people they could read Joel and John Hersey's Hiroshima, which is the only account we have of a nuclear bomb being used in the civilian population. And it's a pretty scary parallel situation. Doesn't mean it has to happen, but that clearly could be what the prophet is seeing is something similar to some sort of nuclear holocaust.
The prophet Joel and Jesus of Nazareth both spoke about signs in the moon as harbingers, warning signs in the heavens of what was about to occur on earth. But what is the message for all of us in this? What is God calling us to do?
Almost every time we see the day of the Lord mentioned, and it's mentioned many times in the prophetic writings, it has to do with judgment. That God will sift the nations. And in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 25, the day of the Lord is when God separates the sheep nations from the goat nations. The word nations is used. It's not an individual separation, but national separation. And he says, as you have done to the least of my brothers, you have done it unto me. I believe he's talking about his Jewish brothers, the nation of Israel, and how we respond to them in their time of need, in the end of the end times, will determine, in many ways, the destiny of nations. So it's so critical that we're ready for the day of the Lord, and we have the fear of God more than the fear of man, that we have a heart for him and whatever he loves, and he loves Israel. We better love his people, the Jewish people.
Here in the hills of Galilee, above the Sea of Galilee itself, it's easy to feel the pulse of our prophetic time, because it was among these hills around the shores that Jesus did so many of his miracles. Today I want to focus on the signs of the times he said would precede the second coming. Harbingers that his coming was closer than ever before. Of course, the passage that we refer to is Matthew 24, but it's also repeated in Luke 21. Both of these gospel writers focus on the signs of the times that Jesus gave. In Matthew 24, he speaks about earthquakes, famines, pestilences, false prophets that would be signs of his coming. But then he speaks about the heavens, the sun, the moon, and the stars. He speaks about a time of great tribulation. And then, right after that, he says this will happen. Matthew 24 and verse 29, immediately after the tribulation, if you like, the trouble of those days, a time of unprecedented trouble on planet Earth. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Luke has a parallel reference to that. In Luke 21 and verse 25, he says, and there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars. And on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. We've seen in the late 20th, 21st century, storms at sea, tsunamis with great loss of life.
Well,